He looked her up and down, sneering at the red dress stretching tightly across her stomach. "I can't even look at you anymore." Her husband spat, walking out to a woman half her size. She thought her life was over. She didn't know the city's most dangerous man was already watching. Sophie Miller stood in front of the floor-to-length mirror in the women's restroom of the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago, desperately tugging at the hem of her crimson dress. She was a size 24, a woman of heavy, undeniable curves. For years she had carried the weight of her body like a secret apology, shrinking her personality to compensate for the space she occupied. But tonight was her 5th wedding anniversary. She had spent weeks saving for this custom dress, hoping the deep sweetheart neckline and the draped silk would remind her husband of the woman he had married. When she walked back out into the glittering dining room, the crystal chandeliers cast a harsh light on her reality. Brent was already seated at their corner table. He didn't stand when she approached. He didn't smile. He was a successful corporate real estate broker, sharp and perpetually restless, his eyes always scanning the room for something better. "You're late," Brent snapped, not looking up from his phone. "I was just fixing my makeup," Sophie said softly, squeezing herself into the booth. She felt the immediate pinch of the table edge against her stomach, a humiliating, silent reminder of her size. "Happy anniversary, Brent." He finally looked at her, and the absolute disgust in his eyes made the breath stall in her lungs. He didn't see the careful styling of her hair or the expensive silk. He only saw her weight. "I can't do this anymore, Sophie," he said. His voice was cold, devoid of any affection. It was a business transaction. "I'm not ordering dinner. I'm moving out." Sophie froze, her hands trembling in her lap. "Brent, what are you talking about?" "It's our anniversary." "It's a wake," he corrected cruelly. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so the neighboring tables wouldn't hear, though his words were designed to cause maximum damage. "Look at yourself. Look at what you've let yourself become. You're massive, Sophie. It's embarrassing. I bring clients to events, and I have to introduce you. Do you know what they think of me when they see my wife is a fat, lazy whale?" Tears pricked her eyes, burning hot and fast. "I have a thyroid condition. Brent, you know how hard I try." "I don't care," he interrupted, tossing a sleek leather folder onto the table. "I filed the papers yesterday. My lawyer will be in touch." Before Sophie could even process the shattering of her marriage, the final twist of the knife was delivered. The maître d' approached their table, followed by a woman. She was petite, fragile-looking, easily a size 2 with sharp blonde hair and a smug smile. She was wearing the exact Cartier love bracelet Sophie had pointed out in a magazine 3 months ago. "Ready to go, baby?" the woman asked, sliding her hand onto Brent's shoulder. "Lexi, this is Sophie," Brent said, casually, standing up and throwing a $100 bill on the table for the water they hadn't drank. "Sophie, Lexi. She actually takes care of her body." Sophie sat frozen in the opulent dining room, surrounded by the clinking of expensive champagne flutes and the murmur of Chicago's elite, entirely alone. She was the fat, discarded wife. She felt the stares of the waiters, the pitying glances of the wealthy patrons. Her world collapsed in the span of 3 minutes. The divorce was a bloodbath. Brent had been planning it for a year. He had hidden assets, transferred his commissions into offshore shell accounts under Lexi's name, and hired a ruthless attorney who chewed Sophie up and spat her out. Because Sophie had given up her career as a pastry chef to support Brent's rise in real estate, she had nothing. She was left with a meager settlement, stripped of her Lincoln Park townhouse, her dignity, and her security. Hitting rock bottom felt like drowning in concrete. She moved into a drafty, tiny studio apartment in Pilsen, a gritty neighborhood far from the manicured lawns she was used to. For weeks, she barely left her bed. She hated her body. She hated the thick thighs that rubbed together the heavy apron of her belly, the soft, fleshy arms that Brent had looked at with such revulsion. But hunger is a powerful motivator. With the last of her settlement money, Sophie made a desperate gamble. She leased a run-down, abandoned corner storefront on 18th Street. The floors were cracked linoleum, and the windows were grimy, but the commercial oven in the back still worked. She named it the Flour Dust. She stopped hiding. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She threw away the excruciating shapewear and bought loose, comfortable vintage dresses that draped over her heavy curves. She poured her grief, her rage, and her broken heart into her dough. She baked rich, decadent pastries cannoli, filled with sweet ricotta, massive sourdough loaves, thick brioche. She didn't lose a single pound. In fact, surrounded by butter and sugar, she might have gained a few. She was unapologetically fat, surviving on the sheer, stubborn will to not let Brent destroy her entirely. She didn't know that her small, warm bakery was located squarely in the territory of the most dangerous organized crime syndicate in the Midwest. And she certainly didn't know that the boss of that syndicate had developed a dangerous fascination with the heavy, beautiful baker on the corner. It was late November, and the Chicago winter had arrived with brutal force. Sleet lashed against the glass of the Flour Dust, the wind howling down the empty streets. It was past 11 p.m. Sophie was alone in the back kitchen, scrubbing the heavy stainless steel prep tables, her thick hips swaying slightly to the faint jazz playing on her old radio. Suddenly the front door violently shattered open the little brass bell, screaming as the heavy oak slammed against the wall. Sophie dropped her rag, her heart leaping into her throat. She crept toward the front counter, grabbing a heavy cast-iron rolling pin. A man was leaning heavily against the display case. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone. He wore a bespoke Italian wool coat that probably cost more than her entire bakery, but it was ruined. A dark, terrifying stain was spreading rapidly across his right side, dripping thick crimson blood onto her pristine, black and white, checkered floor. "Lock the door!" He rasped his voice, a low, gravelly command that demanded absolute obedience. Sophie was paralyzed. He looked up and she gasped. He possessed a brutal, arresting kind of handsomeness. Sharp jawline, aristocratic nose, and eyes as dark and cold as the Chicago River at midnight. But what terrified her was the heavy matte black Glock pistol gripped loosely in his left hand. "I said lock the door, Dolcezza." He gritted out his knees, buckling slightly. Survival instinct overrode her terror. Sophie rushed past him, threw the deadbolt, and pulled down the metal security grate. When she turned back, the man had collapsed onto his back, gasping for air. "I'm calling an ambulance." Sophie panicked, reaching for the rotary phone on the wall. "No!" The word cracked like a whip. He raised the gun, his hand shaking, but the barrel steady. "No cops, no hospitals, just towels." Sophie's breath hitched. She looked at the gun, then at his bleeding side. She dropped the phone. She wasn't a nurse, but she was practical. She ran to the back, grabbing an armful of clean white cotton baking aprons and a bottle of high-proof vanilla extract she used for baking. She dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, he smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and copper. She unbuttoned his ruined shirt. The bullet had passed clean through his side, messy bleeding profusely, but manageable if she could stop the flow. "This is going to burn," she warned, her voice trembling as she poured the alcohol over the wound. The man hissed his back, arching off the floor, his muscles coiled like tight steel springs. But as Sophie leaned over him, using her full heavy weight to press the thick wad of cotton against his side, his dark eyes snapped open and locked onto her. He didn't look at her with the disgust she was so used to. He looked at her like a starving man staring at a feast. Roman Costa, the ruthless head of the Costa Syndicate, was a man who lived in a world of sharp edges, starvation, and cold, hard violence. The women in his world were surgically altered thin and brittle, but the woman above him was a vision of classical Renaissance excess. He felt the soft, heavy press of her large breasts against his uninjured arm as she reached across him. He saw the thick, lush curve of her thighs, kneeling beside him, the plump softness of her flushed cheeks, the generous roll of her stomach under her vintage dress. To Brent, she had been a whale. To Roman, she was the physical embodiment of sanctuary. She was warmth abundance and absolute devastating beauty. "You're so soft," Roman murmured, his blood-stained hand weakly lifting to trace the heavy curve of her hip. Sophie blushed furiously, slapping his hand away. "Keep still, you're bleeding to death." "I've died and gone to heaven," he whispered, a dark, delirious smile touching his lips before he passed out from the pain. Sophie sat with him all night, keeping the pressure steady until the bleeding stopped. Before dawn, while she was dozing against the counter, a black SUV pulled up. Two massive men in suits entered with a spare key, scooped the unconscious man off her floor, and dropped a thick stack of $100 bills wrapped in a rubber band onto the counter. They vanished like ghosts. For 3 weeks, Sophie convinced herself it was a fever dream. She used the money to fix the broken door and buy a new commercial mixer, trying to forget the dark eyes of the bleeding man who had praised her softness. Then he came back. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The bell chimed, and Roman Costa walked in. He was fully heeled, wearing a charcoal Brioni suit that fit him with lethal perfection. He looked powerful, terrifying, and completely out of place in her pastel bakery. 2 bodyguards stood outside facing the street. Sophie dropped a tray of croissants. "You." "Me." Roman smiled. It was a terrifying smile, predatory and possessive. He walked up to the counter, his eyes devouring every heavy curve of her body. "You saved my life, Sophie Miller. How do you know my name?" she whispered, backing up until her hips hit the prep counter. "I know everything about you," Roman said softly, leaning over the glass display. "I know you were thrown away by a fool who couldn't appreciate a true goddess. I know you work from 4 a.m. to 9 p.m., and I know I am going to buy every single thing in this bakery." For the next month, Roman became a permanent fixture. He sat at the corner table every afternoon, sipping black coffee and watching her with hungry, obsessive eyes. He brought her gifts, rare Madagascar vanilla beans, expensive silk scarves that complemented her complexion, and a custom-made leather apron designed specifically to wrap around her wide waist. He never touched her, but his gaze was a physical weight, making Sophie feel beautiful, revered, and dangerously desired for the very body she had been taught to hate. Then came the day the past violently collided with the present. Sophie was wiping down the tables when the door opened. She expected Roman. Instead, she saw Brent. Her ex-husband looked awful. He was unshaven, his eyes manic, his expensive suit wrinkled. Lexi was nowhere to be seen. "Brent," Sophie asked, her stomach dropping. "What are you doing here? I need money." "Sophie," Brent demanded, marching toward her, his face twisted in desperation. "I know you have cash in this dump. Open the register." "Get out," Sophie said, finding her voice. "You took everything from me. I don't owe you a dime." "You fat, useless cow!" Brent screamed, lunging forward. He grabbed her arm brutally, his fingers digging painfully into her soft flesh, trying to drag her toward the counter. "You owe me. I supported your massive weight for 5 years. Give me the money." "Let her go." The voice was so quiet, so cold, it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Brent froze, turning around. Roman Costa had just walked out of the back room, where he had been quietly drinking espresso. The dark Mafia Boss unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the shoulder holster strapped to his chest. His eyes were entirely black, radiating murderous intent. Brent's face drained of all color. His knees visibly shook. He let go of Sophie as if she were on fire. Mr. Costa, I didn't know you frequented this place." Sophie rubbed her bruised arm, looking between the two men. "You know each other?" "Oh, Brenton and I are well acquainted," Roman purred, taking a slow, predatory step forward. "Brenton has a terrible gambling habit. He owes my family $50,000. We were going to pay him a visit tonight to break his legs." Brent dropped to his knees, openly weeping. "Please, Mr. Costa, I came here to get the money. This is my ex-wife. She's a nobody. She's just a fat baker. I was going to get your money from her." The silence that followed was deafening. Roman didn't shout. He moved with the terrifying speed of an apex predator. He grabbed Brent by the throat, lifting the struggling, pathetic man completely off the ground. "This woman," Roman whispered, his voice a demonic rasp, "is a queen. She is a goddess of flesh and warmth. And you are a maggot who dared to touch her." Roman slammed Brent against the wall, pulling his gun and pressing the barrel directly against Brent's forehead. "Your debt is doubled. You have 24 hours. And if you ever look at her, speak to her, or breathe the same air as my woman again, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs. Do you understand?" Brent sobbed, nodding frantically. Roman dropped him, and Brent scrambled out of the bakery on his hands and knees, fleeing down the street. Roman holstered his weapon and turned to Sophie. The violent monster vanished, replaced by a man looking at her with absolute worshipping devotion. He walked toward her gently, lifting his large hands to cup her plump, flushed cheeks. "Did he hurt you, mia dolcezza?" Roman whispered, his thumbs stroking her soft skin. Sophie looked up into the eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe, entirely seen, and incredibly powerful. The heavy brass bell above the door hung entirely silent. Inside the flour dust, the comforting smell of burnt sugar and spilled espresso lingered in the tense air. Sophie stood frozen against the stainless steel prep counter, her breathing shallow. The phantom pressure of Brent's cruel fingers still burned in her memory. Roman didn't rush her. The violent, murderous energy slowly drained from his incredibly broad shoulders as he took a deliberate step closer. His expensive leather shoes scuffed softly against the flour-dusted linoleum. When his large hands cupped her face, they were shockingly warm, the rough calluses standing in stark contrast to his immaculate Brioni suit. "Look at me, Sophie," Roman commanded softly. His thumbs gently brushed the soft, plump apples of her cheeks. She forced her eyes up, meeting his dark gaze, finding only a deep, consuming reverence. "You spent 5 long years shrinking yourself, apologizing for your very existence, all for a pathetic excuse of a man who didn't even deserve to breathe your air." Roman said, his voice a low gravel that resonated in her chest. His hands slid down her jawline, resting heavily on her wide, soft shoulders. "You are not a burden. You are not a joke. You are a masterpiece of flesh and blood. Every heavy curve, every soft edge of your body, it belongs draped over a throne, not hiding in the back of a freezing kitchen." Tears spilled hot and fast down Sophie's flushed face. Society and her ex-husband had mercilessly told her she was a failure purely because of her size. But this man, the most dangerous predator in the Chicago underworld, looked at her large, thick body as if he had finally found his true religion. Over the next 2 months, Sophie experienced a magnificent rebirth. She stopped hiding behind oversized aprons. She bought vintage dresses that hugged the dramatic flare of her hips and proudly displayed the heavy, soft swell of her stomach. The bakery flourished. Word quietly spread through the criminal underbelly that the flour dust was under the absolute protection of the Costa Syndicate. No one dared steal so much as a napkin, but a dying rat bites the hardest. Drowning in gambling debt, Brent was entirely out of options. It happened on a miserably cold, rainy Thursday. Red and blue police lights flashed violently against the rain-streaked windows. Sophie wiped her dough-covered hands as 3 men shoved their way inside. 2 were uniformed Chicago police officers. The third was Cook County Judge Arthur Harrison. Judge Harrison was the corrupt official who had presided over her divorce. He was a pillar of the legal community, a man with cold, watery eyes who had stripped Sophie of her beloved Lincoln Park home with a single stroke of his pen. Now he wrinkled his aristocratic nose at the rich smell of warm butter. "Sophie Miller," Judge Harrison barked, slapping a thick manila folder directly onto her pastry case. "I am officially executing a court-mandated seizure of this property and all its assets." Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. "On what legal grounds I leased this space with my own money? According to an emergency motion filed by your ex-husband's counsel, you fraudulently funded this business using concealed marital assets." Judge Harrison smirked. "The court has frozen your accounts. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate." Sophie felt numb. This was an ambush. Brent had bribed the judge again. Panicked and desperate for the $50,000 he owed, Roman Brent was using his corrupt connections to liquidate her bakery to save his own miserable life. "You can't do this," Sophie whispered, planting her heavy, unmovable body firmly between the officers and the kitchen door. "Move aside," one cop warned, reaching a heavy hand toward her shoulder. Before his fingers could even graze her dress, the bakery door opened with a quiet, deadly click. The temperature plummeted. Roman Costa stepped inside, flanked by 4 massive men in tailored suits. Roman looked entirely hollowed out, devoid of any recognizable emotion, making him infinitely terrifying. He locked his black eyes onto the judge. "Judge Harrison?" Roman purred softly. "What a rare pleasure to find a man of your stature slumming it in Pilsen." The judge paled, taking a frantic step back. "Mr. Costa, I am executing a lawful seizure." "Is it—" Roman tilted his head. He walked to the counter, immediately wrapping a heavy, fiercely protective arm around Sophie's thick waist, pulling her soft body flush against his hard side. "Because it looks like a pathetic extortion attempt, orchestrated by a maggot with a gambling problem." "The law is the law," the judge stammered, sweating profusely. The 2 cops went entirely rigid, recognizing the syndicate boss. Roman smiled a bleak baring of teeth. He snapped his fingers. An enforcer tossed a black leather folio onto the counter. "Let's talk extensively about the law, Arthur," Roman mused, flipping it open. "Let's talk about the offshore account in the Cayman Islands, the one that received a mysterious wire transfer of $200,000 from Brenton's firm exactly 3 days before you signed my Sophie's divorce decree." The silence grew suffocating. Judge Harrison looked physically ill. "Let's also talk about the commercial zoning permits you miraculously expedited for a secret 50% equity stake." Roman continued pulling out glossy photographs. "And the underage escorts at the Drake Hotel last December. The footage is devastatingly clear." Roman casually picked up a heavy cast-iron sugar shaker. He slammed it down with brutal force directly onto Judge Harrison's hand, pinning his fingers to the glass. The judge screamed in sheer agony. The cops didn't dare move an inch. "Here is the new ruling, Arthur," Roman whispered, leaning his handsome face mere inches from the weeping judge. "You will return to your chambers. You will sign a full reversal of the divorce settlement. Sophie gets the townhouse back today. She gets half of Brenton's firm tomorrow. And this bakery, it goes into a blind trust tax exempt for 50 years. If you miss a single comma, I will send these photographs to the Tribune, the FBI, and your wife. Then I will personally take your tongue. Nod if you understand. Whimpering, Judge Harrison nodded frantically. Get out, Roman commanded softly. As the corrupt men scrambled out into the rain, Roman turned to Sophie. The terrifying violence melted from his eyes, replaced by that burning, unconditional worship. He pressed a lingering kiss to the flower-dusted crown of her hair. No one, Roman promised, his hand tightening on her heavy hip, will ever take what belongs to you again. Hard karma is a dish best served cold, but in Sophie's case, it was served with absolute destruction. Within 48 hours, the corrupt foundation of Brent's life collapsed. Judge Harrison, terrified of Roman's retribution, not only reversed the divorce, but initiated an audit into Brent's real estate firm. The hidden accounts were exposed. The IRS froze his remaining assets. Lexi, realizing the money was gone and the Cartier bracelets were being repossessed, packed her bags and left him for a plastic surgeon in Miami. Brent was completely destitute, homeless, and still carrying a doubled $100,000 debt to the most ruthless syndicate in the Midwest. A week later, Sophie stood in the back office of Roman's legitimate front, a sprawling, opulent import/export firm downtown. The room smelled of aged leather, rich mahogany, and dark roasted coffee. She wore a custom-tailored emerald green wrap dress that accentuated the deep plunge of her cleavage and the heavy, unapologetic width of her hips. She was no longer the shrinking, humiliated woman in the bathroom of the Drake Hotel. She was reborn. Roman sat behind his massive desk, watching her with dark, obsessive hunger. There was a knock on the heavy oak door. Two of Roman's enforcers walked in, dragging a pathetic, weeping figure between them. It was Brent. He looked like a corpse. His expensive suit was replaced by stained, foul-smelling overalls. They dropped him onto the Persian rug. Brent looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock as he saw Sophie standing beside Roman's desk, dripping in quiet authority and expensive jewelry. "Sophie," he croaked, his voice raw. "Please, tell them to stop. They have me cleaning the slaughterhouses, scraping the bone traps. I haven't slept in days. Please, you're a good person. You're sweet. Tell him to forgive the debt." Sophie looked down at the man who had mentally and emotionally starved her for 5 years. She felt no pity. She felt no lingering pain. She only saw a weak, pathetic shell of a man who had confused cruelty with strength. She walked slowly around the desk. Her heavy thighs brushed together the silk of her dress, rustling in the quiet room. She stood over him, fully embracing the space she occupied, a magnificent, intimidating monument of a woman. "You used to tell me I was too heavy, Brent," Sophie said, her voice smooth and grounded, echoing with a quiet, lethal power. "You were right. I am too heavy. I'm far too heavy for a weak man like you to ever carry." She turned her back on him, walking toward Roman. "Take out the trash. The smell is ruining my appetite." Roman's chest rumbled with a dark, genuinely amused laugh. He nodded to his men. "You heard the Queen. Take him back to the traps. He has $98,000 left to work off at minimum wage." Brent screamed as they dragged him out, his wails echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy door clicked shut. Silence returned to the office. Roman stood up, walking toward Sophie. The predator was gone, leaving only the devoted worshipper. He didn't just embrace her. He enveloped her. His large hands slid down her thick back, gripping the heavy flesh of her wide hips, pulling her flush against his hard, muscular body. "You are magnificent," Roman murmured, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of vanilla and warm skin. My beautiful heavy queen. Sophie closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. She had lost a marriage, but she had gained an empire. She had stopped trying to shrink to fit into a world that hated her, and instead, she let a dangerous man build a new world entirely around her curves. She was fat. She was powerful. And she was exactly where she belonged. Sophie finally realized that the body she spent her life hiding was the exact reason the city's most powerful man fell to his knees. She wasn't just surviving. She was a mafia queen, ruling her empire, wrapped in the dark, protective embrace of a man who worshipped every single inch of her heavy curves. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge, hard karma, and dark romance, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their true worth, and subscribe for more intense daily stories.